Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Glen Poole, our next speaker, from the UK, now residing in Australia, with a wealth of intactivist experience. Glen currently is a expert advocate for boys and men. He runs stopmalesuicide.com and he works at the Australian Men's Health Forum. Glen, welcome. I realise it's probably sunrise there in Queensland. How are you holding up?
No, I would normally be having a run on the beach, so I hope you all appreciate the sacrifice that I'm making by not being in the surf right now.
It's a tough life. Now, with that, I wanted to ask you, Glen, if you could share with the members of the audience a little bit about your background and your history, because as I said in the introduction, you do have extensive intactivist experience, and now you're an expert advocate for boys and men. So please take it away.
Yeah. So hi everyone, or good day from Australia. And thanks for inviting me. It's so fantastic to see such a great range of passionate people getting together to collaborate around this really important issue. I'm just going to reel back the praise a little bit. I don't consider myself to be in any way an expert intactivist. There are I'm sure every single one of you in this room has more knowledge and experience and passion in that space, but I'm very much more than an ally to the intactivist movement. But I have a much broader focus on gender issues, with a particular focus on the social issues that impact men and boys. And it's worth noting that I come from the UK and I live in Australia, which are nations where, whilst it's clearly an issue, it's not as big an issue as it is in other places like the States. So I've been in this space for nearly 25 years now. I sort of walked into the men's movement backwards with my eyes closed. Firstly, as a full-time at-home dad in the late 90s. And then not too long after that, a separated dad going through the family courts. And in the early 2000s was very involved in some very high profile direct action campaigning around fathers' rights issues that put the issue of fathers going through the family courts on the front page of every national newspaper in the UK for a couple of years. So built a huge amount of experience of doing advocacy work, particularly from that kind of more in your face direct action approach. About 20 years ago, but then began to realize the limitations of that approach, but also began to sort of see the limitations of simply a focus on separated fathers. Got more interested in fatherhood more broadly, but also more interested in the issues that impact men and boys, and could really see the lack of a good, strong, cohesive men's movement was something that showed up all over the place whenever you saw issues that impacted men and boys, whether that was being victims of sexual violence or the problems that fathers face, the ongoing failure of boys in education, men's health and men's shorter life expectancy, male suicide, all these many different issues, which actually, though they often felt separate and disconnected, the more that I worked in the space, the more I found the overlaps. And so I got really interested in what would happen if how do we get people to work together? How do we get people to collaborate? How do we create forums and networks that enable people to support each other? And so I established something called the Men's Network in the UK, which attempted to bring together anyone who is committed to working to improve the lives of men and boys from whichever perspective, and that included bringing the different intactivist organizations into that space with different men and boys organizations, which is when I sort of first got really interested in this particular topic. The Men's Network doesn't exist anymore in name, but it still exists. Its impacts are still felt in the UK. So it's become one of the sort of the successor organisations to that is the Men and Boys Coalition, which is a national coalition of academics, public commentators, charities, all working to support men and boys. And also International Men's Day was something that I started. I didn't start International Men's Day, but I started the celebration of International Men's Day in the UK. And 10 years ago, we used to have about 10 events happening around the country. And now we have hundreds of events with corporates involved, with government involved, with the Prime Minister standing up and marking the day, with a debate happening in Parliament every year around International Men's Day for the last 4 or 5 years. So I have experience of putting men and boys issues on the map, and I have experience of creating networks and vehicles to enable collaboration. And my commitment is always that we make those platforms as inclusive as possible, but also as impactful as possible. And one of the things that I've learned over the years, and this is one of the conversations I'm having with Michael offline, is that in order to be as inclusive as you can be and impactful as you can be, there are times when you actually have to exclude people. And so Michael asked if I'd have a kind of conversation with you about how I, over the years, have actually made decisions about including and excluding people, what criteria I use, and the flavour of that inclusion and exclusion around gendered issues. And I know for some people frame this issue in different ways. Some people frame it as a children's rights issue, as a human rights issue, but there's absolutely no doubt that gender is a part of it. Gender is...
Oh, Glenn, you've gone on mute. I think Siri's done a number on you.
I'm back now.
You are. I think we can also hear your Siri in the background.
Such a dysfunction, isn't it? Yeah. The annoying thing is what she's saying is more intelligent and useful than what I'm saying. But there we go. So I just want to then briefly share sort of the criteria that I use, just broadly around inclusion and exclusion, and then sort of take some comments and questions, because as I understand, this has been a topic of discussion and some tension for this group. So the first thing is to say you need to be really clear about what you are uniting people around. Now, in the first instance, it might just be that you think you're uniting people around a common problem or concern, e.g., circumcision, but it's got to be more than that. It's got to be more than that, and so it's got to be. You've got to actually have an awareness of how, whilst lots of people might agree that the issue is a problem, if you actually dig down a bit deeper and say, well, what is the cause of that problem, and therefore what are the solutions, you'll find lots of different kind of perspectives, and that's where people start to fall apart. Because what do? Do you create alliances which simply bring together people who share the same view, or roughly the same view, on the cause and the solution? And that's a perfectly valid approach to take. Or do you actively seek to bring people together who have difference and a diversity of viewpoints about what the causes are, what the barriers are, and what the solutions are? And if you do that, then you're not simply uniting people around a problem, you are uniting people to collaborate towards a common goal, even though they have different viewpoints about the cause and the solution. And if you don't name that, what will happen is that will bite you on the arse very quickly, because then you'll get infighting about this group should be about doing this, or this group should be doing that. So actually explicitly having a commitment to work with people with different perspectives is important if you're not going to take the route of we're only going to unify people who have pretty much the same view in terms of cause and solution. And so that's kind of one of your first barriers, is not just do these people we want to include share our concern, but do they share our commitment to work with people from different perspectives? Do they share our commitment to diversity, as in diversity of, we hear a lot about diversity of, gender identity and race, and but we don't hear a lot about, or as much as we should do, about worldview diversity, about a commitment to actually bringing together different perspectives and working out how those can cooperate and collaborate. And for me, then, if you actually make that commitment, well, even if you don't, whichever way you go, there's still things you have to take into account. Because even if you've got people who share exactly the same view of the cause and the solution, their approach might be completely inappropriate, because there's approaches to the end goal. And so I found this being in the family law reform space, or the fathers' rights space, that as coming from a kind of direct action background, there were lots of organisations that didn't want to collaborate with us because they didn't want to collaborate. They thought our approach of civil disobedience and high-profile stunts and that kind of stuff was not an approach they wanted to be aligned with. And fair enough, that was absolutely their choice. So I think the first one to get really clear, we're going to give you 4 points and then I'll stop. The first one to get really clear is, and this gets conflated all the time, is ideology and issue. And so people with strong ideologies are very good at conflating their worldview with the issue. And you see this across the gender political, you see it in any space, but you see it across the gender political spectrum. So you'll see, for example, with very sort of strong, feminist organizations who sort of like, will foreground issues like rape and domestic violence. Then if you kind of like disagree with them, you are then seen to be not only disagreeing with work to prevent violence against women, you're actually being seen as the opposite of advocating for violence against women, because this is a very binary view, when actually the reality is the vast majority of people are actually against violence against women. We just have different perspectives about how to resolve that. But the strong ideologues will actually say, no, you can only be for this issue if you share our view of how it's caused and what the solution is. And in very simple terms, from a feminist perspective, it'll always be dismantle the patriarchy and male privilege, right? And then if you go to the other end of the political spectrum, the cause will, in very simple terms, if you get into the sort of the world of the anti-feminist men's rights organizations and some fathers' rights organizations, the problem is always feminists. Doesn't matter what the issue is, the problem is feminists. Suicide, feminists are causing it. Men dying younger, feminists are causing it. Male circumcision, it's feminists' fault. Yeah. And so it's always a good question to ask: is this person more driven by the issue or by the ideology? Because often people with strong ideologies will hide behind emotive issues, like circumcision, like violence against women, but actually when push comes to shove, they will defend their ideology first rather than actually find a way to work with others to resolve the issue. And once people are in that space, it's really hard to work with them unless you all want to work together on the same ideology. So ideology versus issue, don't separate the two. And once you do that, then you can start to go, okay, we share a concern for an issue. We have different ideas, and the thing is, we've all got fucking ideology. Pardon the swearing. We've all got ideology. We've all got an idea of how the world is shaped. We've all got an idea of how, because people say, yeah, the thing is, we're not ideological. They are, but we're all bloody ideological. We've all got our own worldview of why problems occur and what the solutions are. And so it helps if we can own our worldview and acknowledge it as our worldview, not the way the world is. And the more that we do that, the easier it is to actually see that where other people stand on the spectrum of worldviews. So actually having some ownership and honesty and responsibility about your own worldview helps you to make distinctions around other people's worldviews. So you don't get into the space of saying mine's right and theirs is wrong. Because once you get into that space, you've got nowhere to go. Mine's different. However, in this context, I can't work with that one because X, Y, and Z. Another really simple question to ask is working with this person or this group of people going to strengthen or weaken our work? Does it strengthen or weaken us? Does it actually help us or does it hinder us? That's a really reasonable question to ask. Because, you can try and be as inclusive as you like, but there's a limited amount of resource you have. Is working with this person or this individual going to strengthen our cause, or is it going to weaken our cause? And if it's going to weaken it, we need to make decisions about how much time you're prepared to invest with those people. Are these people credible and accountable? So there's many different ways you can measure credibility, but a good one to consider is, are they accountable? If they show up behaving in a way which is not working, how do we hold them to account? Do they have an employer? Do they have a professional body? Are they structured like a charity and therefore have a board that we can go to? Do I have any way of actually holding this individual or this group to account, or are they self-appointed individuals who have no framework of accountability? And finally is, and I've talked about strengthening and weakening, but you also need to consider harm. And rightly or wrongly, associating yourselves with certain people and certain perspectives and certain organizations will harm your organization. It will harm your reputation. It will harm your ability to actually bring other more moderate or cautious organizations on board. And even if it's just reputation, it is a really frustrating thing how easy it is to sort of destroy reputations now and to misrepresent who people are and all the rest of it. But the reality is that damage to reputation can destroy an organization and destroy your ability to actually fulfill your commitment to your cause. So as a group, you should take your reputation very, very seriously. And if you want a reputation for being ballsy and for taking a stand and for having difficult conversations, then sometimes you might want to side with people who on the surface are controversial. But as long as you're all okay with that, and actually if you want your reputation to be a group that actually embraces a diverse range of people and has difficult conversations, then sometimes you might want to bring in people who are a little bit, it's very hard to be in this conversation without finding a few controversial people. But there's a line where people harm your reputation, where it just becomes impossible to actually function as an organization. And you'll find what will happen is you're spending all your time defending one or two individuals in your alliance because you've got people attacking them and therefore you by association all the time. And it is a real proper serious consideration. So in the charity that I run, we actually have a reputational risk register, and on a monthly basis at our board meetings, we're checking what sort of potential reputational risks are on the horizon from different activities we're involved in, because we know that actually damage to our reputation will actually impact the ability of the organization to function, to focus on what's important, to potentially get funding in the future. And that doesn't mean to say that we shy away from anything tough or controversial. It just means that we're professional and responsible, and we take our reputation seriously. So that's the kind of framework that I operate in.
Thank you very much, Glenn. On that note, there's been a huge amount of contention in the ICASM about this issue of who we should collaborate with. Specifically, should we be collaborating with anti-feminist organisations? So I was wondering if you could speak to that. Should the ICASM be collaborating with anti-feminist organisations?
I think so. I try and use the framework because I don't want to make broad sweeping statements. So on the framework of ideology versus issue, if an individual or an organization is primarily driven by concerns of anti-feminism or to the same extent certain feminist approaches too, it may be impossible to work with them, because their framing of the problem will be most likely it's feminists that are the problem, and their primary concern will be always to try and dismantle and attack feminism, just like the primary concern of certain with toxic masculinity or whatever. from my experience, but within collaborative perspective, primary concern will be having arguments with people about the right or wrong approach and about the worldview, because they're driven by the worldview, they're not driven by the issue. And it's a broad, sweeping statement. Now, there are aspects and moments of truth in pretty much. There's a great saying by a chap called Ken Wilber, who did lots of work on how to integrate lots of different worldviews and different perspectives and different approaches. And he said, one of the things he says is, no one is smart enough to be wrong all of the time. And so what I've always found with anti-feminist perspectives is that if you spend time beyond the politics and beyond the shouting and the bile and the arguing, which often goes on goes with any kind of ideological approach, there you will find that there are valid concerns and valid perspectives. And so where I've arrived, and this is just my view, where I've arrived at consistently with any men and boys issues, is that somewhere along the line, feminism will show up, and the women's movement will show up as being a barrier or a hindrance to progress. And so there is truth in some of the arguments that anti-feminists will make that actually feminism is part of the problem. But then at the same time, I will always around pretty much every issue, I will have found feminists who are part of the solution as well. And that's where I'll end up falling out with anti-feminists, because they'll be like, no, never. There's never can a feminist be part of it. And I've seen it in this space for years ago, when what was that lovely young guy doing the human rights work, David, called? I forgot what he's called.
Oh,
he was in the UK for a while, came over to Australia, down in Adelaide.
Oh, Travis
Wisdom.
Travis Wisdom, yes.
Travis Wisdom.
Yeah.
Travis Wisdom, looking at this issue academically through a feminist lens. And when he came over to the UK, we started talking about, he could come to one of our events and talk about that. The anti-feminist activists went crazy. You can't possibly be a feminist and be for men. It's not possible. And they just wanted to argue with him about his worldview, rather than go, oh, how fantastic, wonderful, someone who's looking at this from a feminist perspective and is on our side. And so that's where and that's sort of real tangible examples of where I've seen people, when push comes to shove, favoring the ideology over the issue. And by the way, I've seen this across the gender political spectrum. I'm not demonizing anti-feminists. I've seen feminists do exactly the same thing in the opposite direction, so and that's why I'm making the point. It's about what you need to distinguish is someone coming from primarily an ideological approach, or are they coming from an issues-led approach and open to working with people who actually want to take an approach that allows for different worldviews and different perspectives. And the most fervent ideologues anywhere on the spectrum do not want to collaborate with others. They want to make it about the actual worldview. They want to fight the worldview rather than fight to resolve the issue, generally speaking. And so sorry to beat around the houses with it, Michael, but I'm just, I don't want to dismiss all anti-feminist or men's rights organizations with a sweeping brush, and I don't want to dismiss the claims that actually sometimes feminism can be and the women's movement can be a challenge and a barrier in this space, because my experience is it is, and it can be. So
yes, yeah, thank you, Glenn. I know in your work as a men as an advocate for men and boys, you've encountered times where both feminists are obstacles, but then also amazing supporters and allies. And so I've observed you've always seemed to have this beautiful middle way. You've been able to walk that middle line to take on the support where you can find it, rather than just discrediting the whole group and losing those potential supporters within that group.
Yeah, and you can only navigate that by bringing people into dialogue, because you can only ultimately find out because it's not about whether you're left wing or right wing, or whether you're Christian or not Christian, or whether you identify as a feminist or an anti-feminist, or don't consider yourself to be either. They're just labels, right? And they're just, you know, they're just ideologies that sit outside of your character. It's, you know, ultimately it's about the character of the individual, the character of the organization, and the deeper human values that actually demonstrate your ability to be effective and collaborative and inclusive. And so you've got to, and I think, you know, the really, again, a prime example of that has been some of the great work in the UK for organisations working with male victims of violence, both domestic violence and sexual violence, who are very pragmatic and have often experienced, particularly from the top of the women's movement, the political ideologues sort of like, you know, positioning women as the only victims of sexual violence and domestic violence, and actively fighting against progress to help male victims. But then the reality is at the grassroots level and within organisations, our friends doing that work for male survivors, some of their strongest allies have actually been, you know, women who consider themselves feminists, who are working with victims on a daily basis. And so it's like, you know, when the rubber hits the road, who practically is there to help and support you? It's not, you can't distinguish it by the political label. You have to actually make case by case decisions.
And Glenn, this really speaks to your value of being committed to working with people of a diversity of views, a genuine commitment, because that openness allows these opportunities to arise.
If you come from that space, and you facilitate that, then you model that as a way of behavior, then actually you start to facilitate that behavior between others. And, you know, it's really hard work in the first instance, because often you need one or two individuals being that kind of holding that space and setting aside often your own personal sort of views and perspectives to actually allow space for people to come forward with their own views and perspectives. But over time, what happens is you then build community where actually connections and relationships can build. And that's the power of having networks like this. It's not like you all are one mass body with a shared view and a shared, you know, there's an elevation of voice by coming together, but actually what you're doing is by creating networks, is you're creating opportunities to collaborate. But if you allow toxicity into the space, however you define that, then that can actually keep people away, and it means that you don't have the opportunities to cooperate and collaborate.
And that really speaks to the importance of engaging respectfully, respectful dialogue and respectful disagreement. I wanted to ask you regarding, with your expertise in the men and boys space, AFVM, the Paul Elan group, A Voice for Men, do you think that's as anti-feminist as J4MB, Justice for Men and Boys?
I've not looked at what they've been doing in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, but from experience, they're very aligned. Just have a different flavour because one's American and one's UK. They seem to be very aligned. They work on the International Conference on Men's Issues together very closely. So, yeah, I don't have a scale for measuring how anti-feminist an organisation is, and I don't think that's necessarily the defining term. As I've said, it's about the character of the individuals and whether or not they're able to work collaboratively.
Right. So yeah, you'd really look to the ability to work collaboratively.
Yeah.
That's the metric.
And then all the other measures. Does it strengthen? Does working with them strengthen or weaken your cause? Are they credible and accountable? If you have issues with them, is there some framework of accountability that you can go to and say, look, you know, wasn't so pleased with the way that interaction went. You know, I'm going to need to talk to someone about it. Do you have anyone? Who do you go to when there's an issue with them, or is the individual the individual showing up sort of self-policing and actually not necessarily fit to police themselves? And does it harm get a sense of how are people speaking about those organizations more broadly out in the wider world, and would that harm your ability to build a broad range of collaborations and coalitions?
Thank you, Glenn. Now we have a question or comment from David Balashinsky, followed by